So today we're starting Goblet of Fire, and I had forgotten how much fun the Quidditch World Cup chapters are before the Death Eaters go and make everything really violent and scary. But today I want to talk about masculinity. So the series centers on men and boys, and their responses to the expectations of masculinity often impact their characterization and the plot itself in really important ways. So what I want to think about as we read is first, what do the men in these books value, and how do these values model masculinity for the boys in the book and indirectly for the readers? And secondly, when does masculinity uplift these young characters, and when does masculinity, or more often the pressure to conform to societal standards of masculinity, when do those things make the characters less happy, less healthy, less moral, or kind? So I want us all to be thinking about these things as we read. But today I want to start with our Muggle characters because Vernon is actually Harry's original male role model, even if Harry hates it. So what does Vernon model? We know that he and Petunia occupy pretty traditional gender roles in their marriage. Vernon sees himself as a provider, and this is tied up with his class ambition. It seems like he works hard at his job, and he signals his status with things like the new car that they all have to admire loudly on the street, and the suit that he puts on to meet the Weasleys. Vernon also sees himself as a protector. In Book 1, when the Hogwarts letters start arriving, he buys a gun and takes his family away. And notably, even though Petunia and Dudley think that Vernon is losing it, they don't dare question his authority. He even eventually tries to stand up to Hagrid, even though Hagrid is much bigger than he is. And we're not really meant to empathize with the Dursleys, but this is actually pretty brave. And again in Book 4, we see Vernon physically shielding Petunia from the Weasleys after they blow up the fireplace, and he's using his size to protect her. But Vernon also uses his size to threaten his family. We don't see him beat Harry, but he often threatens to, and we do see him hit Dudley in Book 1, which suggests that he does or has done worse to Harry. Regardless, he uses his physical advantage to force Harry to endure other types of abuse and mistreatment. And though Harry gets away from the Dursleys, Vernon continues to model masculinity for Dudley, who is also violent to Harry throughout their childhood, which his parents actively encourage. Dudley's also physically large, which facilitates this violence, and the dieting that we see in Book 4 is emasculating and humiliating to Dudley, and his father's comments about the food underscore that. Men don't eat this rabbit food. Interestingly, the only way that the Dursley model of masculinity is dominated is through magical violence or threats of violence, all at the hands of male wizards. So in Book 1, Hagrid humiliates and hurts Dudley with his pig's tail. In Book 2, the Dursleys are afraid of Harry all summer until they learn that he is not allowed to do magic outside of school. In Book 3, Harry blows up Aunt Marge. And in Book 4, Harry keeps threatening the Dursleys with his magical murderer godfather, and then the Weasley twins endanger Dudley's life with their new candy by exploiting his vulnerability resulting from the dieting. So this idea of physical strength as kind of a primitive Muggle form of masculinity compared to magical prowess and its capacity for violence shows up throughout the series. Though I think it's partially mitigated through Quidditch. And I say partially because there's a lot of magic and politics to Quidditch too, alongside the show of physical strength. Speaking of politics, Lucius Malfoy is another dubious model of manhood. So like Vernon, he values class and money. He taunts Arthur Weasley for his poverty and his association with Muggles and Muggleborns. But Lucius primarily values power, and he seems to have a lot of political power that stems from his wealth and his status. He manipulates both the Ministry of Magic and Hogwarts, often through threats, but also through generous donations like the Slytherin Quidditch brooms and his contribution to St. Mungo's Hospital. Lucius also values magical power, which he sees as related to blood status. When Lucius gets angry, his hand twitches toward his wand in Book 2, which is in contrast to Arthur Weasley, who goes for his fists, aligning him with both his class and his affinity for Muggles. Lucius's masculinity is an upper-class, pure-blood masculinity. He's not going to get his hands dirty, but he'll wield his power in other, more effective ways. And Draco certainly learns this. Where Dudley is a physical bully, Draco's bullying is about a more subtle kind of power. And to me, it's telling that Crabbe and Goyle rarely actually do violence to anyone. Their size is an implied physical threat, but having them at his side is mostly just a display of Draco's control. He similarly relies on boasts about his father's connections to remind his classmates that he's above the rules and the structures of power at Hogwarts. And while Draco knows that he can get laughs and he can get inside Harry's head by questioning Harry's masculinity, for example in Book 3, when Harry passes out on the train because of the Dementor, and Draco makes fun of him, when it comes to himself, Draco seems really secure in his belief that physical strength is a less important indicator of masculinity than power is. So he's willing to feign physical weakness for the purposes of the long game power move of getting Buckbeak executed. Similarly, Draco boasts that he's a good flyer, and Harry even reports that this is true, but Draco gets his dad to buy Slytherin new brooms to get him a spot on the Quidditch team. And apparently he doesn't see this as embarrassing because as an upper-class boy, power has more value than athleticism. As I've said before, pure-blood supremacy is also implicitly about sex. So though Draco often derides Ron, Lupin, and Hagrid for their poverty, it's when he and his father go after Hermione that they become really, really vicious. And her status as both female and Muggle-born seems to bring out their misogyny. And in the Dark Mark chapter of this book, the comments from Draco that kind of read as threats of sexual violence. He's only 14, but Draco's his sense of empowerment and his sense of entitlement and power, and his disrespect for Hermione, and his confidence that the law can't touch him, give me a real kind of Brock Turner vibe in this moment. Okay, so Lucius Malfoy's foil is Arthur Weasley, who I think gives us and his sons and Harry a much different model of masculinity. So it's certainly true that, like the Dursleys, the Weasley parents occupy these traditional gender roles in their marriage. Molly does the cooking, the cleaning, the shopping, she does the emotional labor, and the bad cop parenting. While Arthur works at the ministry and gets to be the parent who asks the twins, how did the flying car do when they rescue Harry in Book 2, and says, just don't tell your mother about the gambling in Book 4. But overall, their partnership seems much more equal than the Dursleys, and I think we've also speculated that some of the gender inequities are exacerbated by structural issues in the magical world, such as the apparent lack of education for kids under 11. And this, again, mirrors structural problems related to gender equity in our world. But Arthur is also a very present and involved dad. He seems to know each of his kids well, and he spends a lot of time with them at home and on outings, both with and without Molly. He also welcomes Harry and Hermione into his home, and treats Harry in particular as another child, another son. And as the first proper father figure Harry's really seen or had, Arthur has an impact on Harry both in the present and in terms of thinking about the kind of man he wants to become. Arthur also values hard work and providing for his family. He's devoted to and proud of his work at the ministry, even if he's not insufferable about it the way that Percy is. And even though Lucius mocks him, Arthur's job does provide for a family of 9 and allow him to do things like take his kids and their friends to the World Cup. But he's sensitive to Lucius's jabs about being poor, even though Arthur knows and points out that he values other things more than money. In Book 2, he turns deep red at Flourish and Blots, and in Book 4, he has to force a smile in front of Fudge. But unlike Ron, Arthur's old enough and secure enough that he doesn't let himself rise to Lucius's bait. About money, that is. But, like Ron, Arthur is ready to fight when the Malfoys go after Hermione for being Muggle-born. So that's the comment that makes Arthur snap in Flourish and Blots in Book 2 and throw himself at Lucius, just as Ron tries to curse Draco with his broken wand when Draco calls Hermione a mudblood. So Arthur models a protectiveness and a responsibility that extends beyond his own family to other people and creatures who are marginalized or vulnerable in some way. And sometimes, in his work especially, that instinct is paternalistic in kind of a problematic way that echoes colonialist attitudes toward, quote, primitive people. But often it's paternalistic in a kind and appropriate way, like when Arthur ensures that Harry gets safely to the train in Book 3 and pulls him aside to talk to him about Sirius. So if these are the 3 fathers that we see in this series, there are no shortage of other adult men providing different models of masculinity. There's Snape, who picks on his students to demonstrate his own power over them, which seems to be a reaction to his own experiences as a teenager, when he was physically and verbally bullied by the cool boys, James and Sirius. But instead of empathizing with a boy like Neville, who's depicted as not especially masculine, Snape bullies him, showing off for the new generation of cool boys in Slytherin. Then there's Hagrid. Hagrid's a heavy-drinking, big-bearded man who spends a lot of time outdoors working with scary, magical creatures, but also has these feminine-coded hobbies like knitting. He's nurturing toward the trio and toward animals. He squeals with delight when the baby dragon Norbert knows his mummy. Hagrid also cries and talks openly about his feelings, and he's one of the very few adults in the series that gives the kids direct advice about how to be better in relationship with other people. He tells Ron and Harry that they have to stop being jerks to Hermione. Dumbledore, Sirius Black, Lupin, Fudge, Lockhart, and Moody all provide interesting and different models of masculinity, as do some of the older boys like Oliver Wood, the elder Weasley brothers, even Victor Crumb and Cedric Diggory. Even the scene with all the ministry officials in the Dark Mark chapter of this book shows us several different kinds of adult masculinity in conflict with one another. So my second question was, what do the younger male characters take away from these and other broader societal conceptions of what it means to be a man, and how does it affect their choices? So I think we've seen what masculinity looks like to Draco and Dudley, but what about Ron and Harry? So Ron, we see from the first scene on the train in book 1, is always in his brother's shadows, and he feels like he'll never live up to their examples. And because there are so many of them, he has a lot of different examples to live up to. He feels the expectation to do well in school, to be popular, to be an athlete, to get a good job after Hogwarts. And interestingly, it's in sharing this worry and vulnerability with Harry that the two of them bond and become friends. And Harry and Ron continue to have a close friendship with a lot of trust and vulnerability that echoes the teenage friendship between Lupin, Sirius, and James, and the later adult friendship between Lupin and Sirius, which really is one of the very few examples of adult male friendship in this series. But Ron also experiences jealousy throughout the books, because he's always implicitly in competition with Harry, and Harry's always going to shine brighter. He's the chosen one, and he's the hero of this narrative. Harry's the athlete, the leader, the famous boy who lived. And Ron is the beta male, the sidekick who rarely gets to be the star. Ron also experiences jealousy in this book of Victor Crumb, whom he initially idolizes as a sports hero, but that admiring relationship of teenage boy to celebrity athlete changes very quickly when Crumb becomes a romantic rival, and Ron is, once again, outshined by another man. The text also tells us that Ron is poor, which is a constant source of embarrassment to him. And although we've seen that for the adult male characters, wealth and the ability to provide are connected to their masculinity, for the children this connection is less strong. After all, Ginny is just as humiliated by her secondhand books as Ron is, as she tells Tom Riddle in book 2. But book 4 makes this connection more explicit for Ron when his mom buys him these frilly dress robes because they're the best that they can afford, and he's mortified. Harry, in contrast, has the money for new, more masculine dress robes. But Harry has different problems. And I think it's important to acknowledge that Harry's abusive childhood has left him with understandable issues around trust, not to mention the spotlight that follows him everywhere in the wizarding world. So this isn't just an average kid exploring what it means to be a man. Harry's got pretty unique circumstances. He goes through the world with a scar right on his face that tells everyone who he is. So I can imagine that everyone he meets initially treats him with this combination of reverence, curiosity, and pity. And at first he's just desperate to prove that he belongs, and then in book 2 that he's not an evil maniac. But around book 3 is when I see Harry really starting to worry about being perceived as weak. So when he faints on the train because the Dementors affect him more than other people, he hates that he's taken to the hospital and everyone fusses about it. And later Draco taunts him, and he does these sort of dramatic reenactments of fainting that are meant to poke fun at Harry's masculinity. So Lupin has to reassure Harry that his vulnerability to Dementors isn't because it's weak, and he says it's a sign that you've been through something really horrible and challenging. But Draco continues to tease him and to goad him to go after Sirius Black, implying that Harry's not brave enough, or that he lacks the appropriate masculine qualities of anger and vengeance. When the first Quidditch match comes, the Dementors cause Harry to fall from his broom and they lose. Harry's again in the hospital and feels that his weakness has let his team down. And remember that in the past he's played through a game with a rogue bludger and had his arm broken rather than potentially forfeit and let down his teammates. So we've talked about why, in book 3, Harry chooses to sneak out to Hogsmeade, and I think it's directly related to this feeling that he doesn't want to be seen as weak or afraid. The first time that he goes, it's with the map that he gets from his Quidditch teammates, and he doesn't even go get his invisibility cloak. So this is Harry showing himself and others that he's not scared. But in doing this, he actually puts himself and his friends in danger. If Sirius Black really had been a murderer who'd blow up an entire street, Harry's reckless need to prove his masculinity could have resulted in the same outcome in Hogsmeade. And I think we see that same sort of instinct in the first chapters of Goblet of Fire. Harry's had this dream and his scar hurts, but he won't write to his friends or to Dumbledore because he thinks it'll make him look weak. He doesn't want the Weasleys to think he can't handle a little pain, or the twins to think he's losing his nerve. He does eventually remember that he can tell Sirius, but even then he censors himself, downplaying the incident. And we can speculate about whether telling someone earlier could have changed anything, but keeping these kinds of things to himself and trying not to appear vulnerable certainly doesn't help Harry. It makes him more isolated, which we'll particularly see in book 5. So there's a lot more that I could say about Harry's ideas of masculinity and how they don't always serve him well, but this has gotten long, so I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about these chapters soon.